Well, as always, thank you so very much for everyone for you for being here, for New College Berkeley for making this possible. I know I say this every time, but it's really, really cool to be able to host these events. And I was going to say something like they're always interesting, but you can have movies and sports are interesting, but maybe not important. And I think something like this, Fight Like Jesus, is important. So it's cool to be able to have these type of events. If you have been in this event before, any of these kinds from New College, they have wonderful events on their event page. Please, I would like to put a plug in to check possible links. As you see on the video, we have today with us Jason Porterfield. And I'll admit to not necessarily at first liking the title, Fight Like Jesus, but it totally got me. And then the idea of waging peace, because it's a bit of a word person, me, and liking those words. Also, I live near Vancouver, Canada, and know a few different ministries that work in the poorer area of Vancouver. And this got me interested in Jason's work because there's something to writing, but then there's also something to actually having your feet on the ground, your boots on the ground, as it were. And in his bio, he says, his passion is to cultivate God's shalom wherever it is painfully absent and to help churches embrace their peacemaking vocation. And again, not just as a thing of passion, because it is filled with passion, but the boots on the ground thing really, really gets me to have respect for it. And also, as I was reading the book, and it's loaded with scripture references, and I was thinking to myself, you know, for some of the hawkish friends that I have, I wonder what they would say in terms of all the scriptures that are used. And I think, Jason, you even mentioned in one of the interviews that you do have some readers who are not necessarily from, you know, that side of the camp that are more embracing and are more willing to listen. And I think that's really, really exciting. And if you could tell us about that, you know, after we're started. We also have here with us one of New College Berkeley's own, Michael Barram, who is a New Testament scholar. Michael is a professor of theology and religious studies at St. Mary's College of California and the chair of the Forum on Missional Hermeneutics. He also has a recent book co-authored with John Franke, Liberating Scripture, an Invitation to Missional Hermeneutics. Another little advertisable blurb. We are going to be doing something, and so check your mailbox, your links for that event as well. Now, just a few comments in terms of housekeeping. This event is being recorded and will be made available in the near future. We will send out links. The interview part of the event will go for about an hour, followed by the remainder of time for interaction from all of you lovely folks. In terms of questions, if you could send them all via chat to NCB, and then I'll read them out loud. If you don't want your name mentioned along with the question, then just put that in along with the question. I think that should be everything. Just an amendment. Don't send the questions to NCB. If you send them to me, to Matthew's team, and then I will see them and I will read them. And so, Jason, to get us started, and thank you very, very much for your willingness to do this. In the preface of To Fight Like Jesus, you described your experience in Vancouver as a failed peacemaker. Can you tell us more about that experience and how it led you to write this book?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you. It's good to be with all of you on this Monday of Holy Week to get to talk about Jesus and his final days leading up to the cross and his resurrection. I'm actually going to try to back up a little further than I do in the book. In the book, I start with my time in Vancouver in the downtown east side. But I thought I'd try to supplement some stuff in case some of you have actually read the book. You get some extra content, right? So I grew up in a military family, both parents in the military, lived in 8 different places by the age of 6, eventually settled into Pennsylvania, where we attended a pretty patriotic church, you know, a sandwich between a Navy base and an Army base. The first word in the church's name was country. Like that kind of gets at how, you know, patriotic it was. And I loved it. It was a beautiful church, a loving church that taught me to love Jesus. For college, I went to a school called Messiah College, now university. It's a historically Brethren in Christ school, so one of the historic Peace Church traditions. By the time I went there, maybe 10% of the staff, 5% of the students were from an Anabaptist background. That was not my background. A few weeks into my freshman year, 9/11 happened. And I was actually watching live coverage on TV. as the second plane flew into the tower, and we all suddenly realized that first plane was not an accident. So I took off as fast as I could to run down to the gymnasium because it was a Tuesday morning. We were going to have chapel in about half an hour. But no one's ever looked at me and said, like, that boy's a runner. So I was like the 10th person to get there in time to tell the school chaplain, Evie Telfer, what had happened. We all sat in just stunned disbelief during chapel, and then classes were canceled that day. And that event proved just so formative for my 4 years at Messiah. We all began to grapple with what does it mean to follow Jesus in a world that seemed to be ever increasingly consumed by war. The next year, spring of my sophomore year, the shock and awe campaign, the bombing of Baghdad, had begun. And I worked in food service there to make some money on campus. And so one day I was tasked with delivering pizzas. And I'll never forget going to a dorm room. It was actually one of the dorm rooms on my floor of my dorm building. And I walked into the room, and the room was packed with students. And they were all gathered around a TV throwing a pizza party. And it took me a while to realize what was going on. But they were watching live coverage of the bombing of Baghdad. And the louder the explosions, the louder they cheered. And I wasn't a pacifist at this point, but I remember walking back to the Falcon and thinking, man, that doesn't seem right for Christians to be cheering the death of others. My junior year, the school still had a little bit of its peace heritage that it was holding on to. So every year they had a peace week. And this particular week, my junior year, they invited a Catholic peace activist named John Deere to come and speak. And so there we all are in the gymnasium, sitting on the bleachers, and he began his message. I don't remember the exact wording, but it was something like this. When Jesus said, love your enemies, I think he probably meant don't kill them. And I remember thinking like, well, yeah, that makes sense. But about a third of the student body stood up, and they began to stomp on the metal bleachers, which was so loud that the speaker had to stop talking. And then they slowly marched out of chapel. So today, I mean, our country's divided, right? Back then, like at the start of the Iraq War, the war had an over 90% approval rating. We were united around that. But I remember just grappling with some of my Mennonite friends with, but what does it mean when Jesus says, love your enemies? What does it mean to pray for those who persecute you? And they also really got me thinking about God's heart for the poor and the marginalized, so much so that by the time I graduated Messiah, I was convinced that God was calling me to be a foreign missionary, a missionary with my vocation being that of a peacemaker. And I thought of that in the very broad, holistic sense of like shalom, right? Where all is as it ought to be. There's healing, health, and wholeness. There's human flourishing in all aspects of life. It's not just the absence of violence, right? That's what I felt called to move into places where God's shalom was painfully absent and to work to cultivate God's peace there. And so about a year after college, I packed my bags, said goodbye to friends and family, and I flew across the continent and moved into Canada's poorest neighborhood. It's a section of Vancouver known as the Downtown East Side. It's a small neighborhood. It's like 4 by 8 city blocks. On any given night, you'll find about 5,000 neighbors there struggling with drug addictions, 1,200 experiencing homelessness, and over 900 women trapped in prostitution. So that was the neighborhood. But what I didn't know until I arrived, because I didn't do my homework, was that the neighborhood had also been living through a nightmare for years. A couple weeks after I arrived, the trial began in a nearby courthouse for Robert Pickton, the man we would all soon learn was Canada's deadliest serial killer. So for over a decade, Pickton would drive into the downtown east side, pick up a woman engaged in sex work, take her back to his farm, and kill her. And by the time of his arrest, he had butchered and fed to his pigs the bodies of 49 women. He actually lamented to an undercover cop how he had been caught one shy of his goal. So, my neighbors were just devastated. And it didn't take long before my neighborhood's brokenness broke me, right? Like the drugs just seemed so powerful. The poverty was so pervasive. And I think the heaviest burden was the despair, that sense of despair in my neighborhood. And so one day I dragged myself to church. I actually had to walk a mile there, right? And Grandview Calvary Baptist Church on Commercial Drive. And I remember sitting down in the pew, and I was so depressed. And it turned out to be Palm Sunday. So yesterday, right? The first day of Holy Week. And like at most churches, this was a joyous occasion. The kids waving palm branches, all the songs are in major keys, no minor chords, right? It's just everyone's chanting Hosanna. And I was in no mood to participate. So I remember just crying out in my pew, God, I'm a failure of a peacemaker. Like, I have no idea how to cultivate your shalom in this place. I thought I did, but I don't. But I still believe you desire to breathe new life into dying communities. So would you teach me how to be a peacemaker? And this was one of those rare times where the answer to my prayer came pretty quick. When the pastor began his feel-good message, I just thought, I don't really want to listen. So I thought, I'll read the gospel accounts of Palm Sunday. And I randomly chose Luke's gospel. And that's when I noticed something I had overlooked every time previously. And that's that Luke tells us that as the crowds were shouting cheers as Jesus made his not so triumphal entry into Jerusalem, Jesus was shedding tears. And when he could hold back his grief no more, he cries out for everyone to hear. So we don't even have to guess about the reason why he was crying. He says, if only you knew on this of all days, the things that make for peace. And I just remember saying in the pew right then and there, just, yes, God, like that's the desire of my heart, to learn from you the things that make for peace. Would you teach me those things? And I felt like God said, well, then you need to study the greatest peacemaker's greatest week, Jesus during Holy Week. And so that became really what birthed ultimately this book. I mean, I didn't start to study Holy Week to write a book, but I quickly realized that there was no resource out there that looked at how Jesus waged peace during Holy Week. And so eventually I felt compelled to write it.
Oh, thank you very much, Jason. That's super helpful. And not to disagree with Matthew, but I got to say, when I read the title, Fight Like Jesus, I was like all in all of a sudden. That probably says something about me, but I had started my own sort of odyssey and thinking theologically before I went to seminary. I was doing a lot of traveling in Central America in the mid 80s, right? And was exposed to liberation theology and things like that. And so the notion of la lucha, right? The struggle, the fight, for justice, for peace, for the poor, was sort of part of the DNA that I'd grown up with as an 18, 19-year-old. So I was super intrigued with the title and found it very challenging, the content inside, and something that you're helping me to keep thinking about every day. So I just want to thank you. Thank you for the book.
Thanks.
Maybe I think a number of folks that I see on the Zoom screen here have in fact read the book, but I know not everybody has. So could you take a moment for those who haven't read it and give us maybe your kind of 1 to 2 minute sort of elevator summary of what it's about, what you're trying to do in the book, what the argument is. You've already started with the notion of Jesus crying out over Jerusalem, but maybe kind of take it from there. And so what is it you're doing in the book generally?
Yeah, great question. Let me first just say, since both you and Matthew brought it up, publishers love controversial titles. It actually wasn't my first idea. It was one of the ones I listed. I thought, I don't really like it, but maybe they will. I do like how it shows that Jesus is active, like he's actively contending for peace. But anyways, so a 1 to 2 minute summary of the book. So most books on Christian peacemaking that I've read, at least, they tend to focus on Jesus's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. And I think that's for good reason. It contains the core of his peace teaching, like, blessed are the peacemakers. Do not violently resist an evil person. Love your enemies, right? Pray for those who persecute you. Bless those who curse you. Go a second mile. Turn the other cheek. My problem in the downtown east side was I could quote Jesus's peace teaching verbatim, but I had no idea how to apply it, not in the messiness and complexity of that neighborhood. And so this book, in a nutshell, it tries to do two things, which, those who study the craft of writing know you're not supposed to try to do two things with a book, but I did. The first thing is that it's a training manual. It's a training manual that seeks to help Christians become more effective and faithful practitioners of Jesus's approach to peacemaking. So the reason I focus on Holy Week is when you take all four Gospels and you look at their content, a third of their content focuses on Jesus's last week. Mark's Gospel, half of it is on Jesus's last week. And he's like in a hurry to get there. You know, the first 8 chapters immediately and immediately this and immediately that. And then we get to Holy Week, right? And there's a lot of teaching and dialogue during Holy Week, but there's also a lot of action. It is action-packed. In other words, Holy Week is the main stage on which we get to see Jesus put all of his previous peace teaching into action, the very thing I so desperately long to see in the downtown East Side. So, like I say in the book, you know, formerly abstract principles like be merciful, they find concrete expression during Holy Week. And lofty ethical ideals like love your enemies, they become grounded in actual events. The other thing that this book tries to do is it's basically a commentary on Holy Week. And that's because I believe Jesus's lament, if only you knew the things that make for peace, is the interpretive key to understanding his final days. You know, the passion with which it was spoken, it's one of only 2 times Jesus was crying. I think it shows the depth of Jesus's concern here. This wasn't a trivial matter, like to contend for peace and to correct the misguided methods that we use when we try to make peace. And so, you know, I think that lament reveals that making peace was what was on the forefront of Jesus's mind as he entered into his final days. And I know I'm making a lot of one little letter, but I think it's important that he said the things, plural, that make for peace. I think we often reduce Jesus's peacemaking efforts to one solitary act, the cross. And for good reason. It's the culmination of how Jesus makes peace. But I believe that Jesus was crucified on Friday precisely because of how he contended for peace on the previous days of Holy Week. And here's why that's important. If we fail to recognize this, then despite all our familiarity with the events of Holy Week, and despite clinging to the cross of Christ for our salvation, we may one day be horrified to discover that we've actually embraced a very different approach to peacemaking, one that justifies killing enemies, one whose methods include nailing criminals to crosses. Okay, so in short, a 10-second answer after probably a 4-minute answer, it's a commentary on Holy Week and a training manual for peacemakers.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I got to say, personally, I loved your sort of observation, right? I think this is on Friday, actually, where you talk about, right, the gospel writers spent very little time on the crucifixion, as you point out, right? And I love the line, and I'm not quoting directly here, but you said essentially the cross is the end result of a life that we're called to imitate, right? And I think that is the point, because certainly I grew up I was the child and the grandson of pastors, right? And the message I got in my evangelical background was it's all about the cross. It's all about the cross. You can pretty much fast forward through all the other stuff, right? And I think what you're pointing out is Jesus was making peace, you know, constantly, and it's not just a matter of the content of the Sermon on the Mount, but it's the practical. How do we put this into action? And we're not good at this, and how do we explore that? So I love that, both facets of the book that you're talking about there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the gospel writers, they front load their coverage of Holy Week.
Yes, absolutely. About
6% focuses on the cross itself, or the crucifixion.
Right.
You know, I'm not going to say the name of the book, but one popular book that goes through each day of Holy Week, it gives 14 pages for Palm Sunday through Wednesday out of 200 some pages. And the gospel writers do the opposite. So I was trying to do justice to that. You know, I am passionate about the cross, but I think the irony is when we say we want to make much of the cross and we lift up the cross, we often fail to realize that we've actually just uprooted it from its context, and we've severed it from the life of the one who gives it meaning, that Jesus was crucified on Friday by living a cruciform life on the days leading up. Yeah.
Absolutely. Very helpful. So getting kind of moving a little more deeply here into kind of what do we take away, right? You quote a friend on page 109, and you say that your friend often likes to say, where you stand determines what you seek. right? And this is something that resonates deeply with me, at least. And I think it's a critical insight, which in scholarly worlds we often talk about in terms of social location, right? That
Yeah.
there's something that means that, it's often described in terms of race and gender and class and so forth. But there are many other ways in which we encounter what we encounter in the world, how we show up in the world is deeply shaped by our characteristics, our identities, our experiences, our perspectives, and so forth. So, and then when it comes to biblical interpretation, right, our social locations as readers, as communities, it seems to me can both facilitate our ability to see and hear things, but also potentially hinder us from seeing and hearing things. That's kind of how I heard your opening response to Matthew's question. So one, does that sort of notion that we come to the text as not as blank slates, but as those who are already shaped, does that resonate with you? And if so, can you maybe give us a few examples of how you see social location for the North American church, both either illuminating or alternatively making it harder for us to, or challenging for us to see what is in fact in there in the text, particularly as you're writing about, in Fight Like Jesus?
Yeah, great question. It reminds me of a book I read in seminary called Doing Christian Ethics from the Margins. It's this, like you said, this idea of social location, or like my friend Kristen Jack, who had spent, Kristen's from New Zealand, actually a guy named Kristen, and over 20 years in the slums of Cambodia before returning to New Zealand and working with at-risk youth. He, as an aside, actually, he wrote a brilliant book called Fire and Faith. It's a historical novel that retells the story of Sebastian Castellio, a reformer who actually led the school in Geneva under Calvin, lived with Calvin for a while until Calvin turned on him and doggedly pursued him until his death. And I helped Kristen edit that novel, and Kristen died from terminal cancer the day after publishing that novel a couple of years ago. But Kristen was a dear mentor of mine, and he loved to say, where you stand determines what you see. And I often think of like a Pringle can, like you look at it from the one way and it looks like a circle, and from the other way it looks like a rectangle, or I've never thought of this before, but like you look at me straight on and you think he's got a whole head of hair, and then you look at me like that and you're like, oh man, he's balding, right? Like your perspective really makes a difference, right? Um, so I thought about this a lot as I wrote the book. The classic example that I remember from seminary, before I give some examples from the book, is the parable of the prodigal son. And I remember hearing some seminary prof ask, why did the prodigal son end up with nothing and wanting to eat the food of the pigs? And when this was asked in different parts of the world, different social locations, some said, oh, it was obvious. It's because of his sinful living. And others said, well, it's because it says there was a famine. We've experienced famine. And others still said, well, it's because it says that no one would help him. There was no community, right? Social location can really help, can really affect the way that you see a passage. So let me give a few examples from Fight Like Jesus. The first one I've already mentioned. I think it's no coincidence that I didn't notice Jesus's lament until my emotions no longer matched the crowd's glee, but rather matched my Savior's grief on that day. It was because I myself was grieving and hurting for my city that I noticed that Jesus was grieving and hurting for his city. Do you see that where you stand determines what you see? I think of in the downtown east side, all the time we would see well-meaning out-of-town church groups drive in. It was usually a youth group in like a 12, 15 passenger van. And they'd pull up. Often they'd even like come up on the sidewalk, and 12 chipper youth would jump out. There was always one boy that thought he was like the next Chris Tomlin, and he'd start belting some praise songs, and someone would shout free food, and like a whole herd of like my neighbors would suddenly materialize, not miraculously, you're going to say free food, and they'd hand out the paper lunches, and it would be done in like a minute and a half. And inevitably, half of the neighbors wouldn't get any food. They'd jump back in the van, drive off into the sunset, right? It was like these rapid acts of kindness, like a hit and run of kindness or something. And sometimes the fights would break out afterwards. But what my neighbors didn't know was that you could actually get free food 23 times a day in the downtown east side. They didn't know that because they never asked. the missional community I was a part of, some of us, we spent a week voluntarily homeless, and that's how we learned that. So when I see that, it made me notice that Jesus on Monday, today of Holy Week, that he doesn't just go into the temple and go berserk. No, it says that Jesus went into the temple the night before, and it says he looked around and he assessed the situation. And I think I actually noticed that because I had seen the damage caused by so many Christians who forgot to assess the situation before they came up with an action plan, right? Or I think of, I talk about the little apocalypse, this text in Matthew's gospel on Tuesday of Holy Week. And it has this line, let me read it for you. It says, "When you see the abomination that causes desolation, flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down or enter the house to take anything out. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter." Now, I don't know about you, but most of my life, when I read that passage, I just thought, that's harsh. That's harsh. Like, why wouldn't God let them even go back and get their coats? And why is he going to take it out on pregnant women? Like, what's going on? And it wasn't until my friend Nay Greenfield, a member of our missional community, shared her story. She was a wartime refugee, born in Cambodia during the genocide, and her mom and brother, they were forced to flee, traveling at night, sometimes hiding even in trucks, a manure truck once, and walking through the jungles until they finally got to Vietnam, to a refugee camp where they lived for a while, and eventually made it to New Zealand. And I remember her saying, this is exactly the experience of other wartime refugees. Like, do you risk waiting to go grab your coat? And how hard it is for pregnant women who are forced to walk long distances and to walk during winter and escape. And suddenly the whole passage takes on new meaning for me, right? As I listen to someone who actually was a wartime refugee. I think about, Robert Pickton, Canada's deadliest serial killer that I mentioned. He would never have been able to kill so many women if his victims had been prominent women from the center of society. Instead, the vast majority were First Nations women from my neighborhood, women who had been marginalized and pushed aside. Hearing their stories over and over again, and many of the survivors and who had lost their friends, right, who were also experiencing trauma from their childhood when they had been stripped and forcibly removed from their families and put into residential schools, many of them run by churches, dealing still with that trauma. As I listened to them, it opened my eyes to begin to realize that on Wednesday of Holy Week, no wonder why this woman is left unnamed. She too is being marginalized. No one asks her name. No one offers her a seat at the table. And like I say in the book, her hesitancy, she doesn't say a word, her hesitancy to speak in the presence of men is contrasted by the disciples' lack of hesitancy in speaking out against her. I never noticed that until I lived amongst women who had been marginalized all their life. One final example. The missions group I joined, Servants, started out in New Zealand in 82. And I think it was a Baptist missionary, Vic Riggs, started it. Everyone in Servants feels called to live with the urban poor, primarily in the slums of some of the big cities in Asia. Vancouver was the first Western expression. Servants did not have any stance on nonviolence when it started. But about 10 years in, they developed a very strong commitment to nonviolent forms of peacemaking. Why? Because they saw how the poor, their neighbors, were disproportionately affected by violence, both as the ones who tend to be conscripted to do the fighting for the wealthy and those who are injured and killed in such wars. And so they developed this strong stance on nonviolence. And it's what I saw. I've lived in impoverished areas of 3 cities in the US, Philadelphia, Wichita, Los Angeles. And in each, there was at least one military recruitment center within walking distance of my neighborhood. And you'd see recruiters walking through the neighborhoods almost every day, right? You never see that in a wealthy suburb, right? And so I think that perspective, that social location helped me realize that on Thursday in the garden, who's the victim of Peter's violence? It's the high priest's servant, forced to do his master's dirty work, right? Like, and so those are just a few examples. I hope that that's a decent answer, at least, to your
No,
question.
absolutely. No, that's fantastic. I mean, actually, the last point you made, I was thinking about, this is something I always think about with my own university students, because we do a lot on poverty issues and so forth. And I say, you know, I live in a neighborhood city here in the Bay Area called Richmond that kind of has a reputation for being one of the poorer neighborhoods in the city, or in the metropolitan area. And I say something very similar, right? I see more predatory check cashing, lending places, right? Liquor stores, those kinds of things than I do in most other neighborhoods, right? And your recruiting comment is very, very helpful. Some of I love that the ways that you were getting at the sort of social location piece. I don't know if you know a colleague of mine who actually is a faculty member at your alma mater, Drew Hart. Yeah, so Drew has been a co-editor with me and so forth, and just a couple of the folks on the call today may have heard me say this, but just to kind of echo some of the things you're saying. He was doing a review of a book of mine when I was going through a part of the story of Zacchaeus. And for those of you who may not know, Drew is a Black theologian and somebody that I deeply, deeply respect. And so he was doing this review of this book, and he said, I like the book and so forth, but he got to the part where I dealt with Zacchaeus. And he says, I got to say that Barram gets all the way through recognizing Zacchaeus is paying back, and more so for what he has stolen and so forth, or whatever, right? And Barram stopped short of actually saying that what Zacchaeus is doing is paying reparations.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like that social location thing became completely clear to me, right? Because that had just not been something that occurred to me. And so I deeply appreciate your willingness to share even the ways that you're seeing new things, that you see, readers seeing new things in these. It's in a certain way, you've already answered this question perhaps, but I'll give you a chance to maybe add on to that if there's anything else. The question that I was thinking of was that you've raised so many issues. There's so many crucial insights in this book. As you were pondering and writing it, were there two or three discoveries maybe that you haven't already mentioned that just jumped out at you for your own thinking, your faith, your sort of practice as a peacemaker that just kind of floored you and that you're still wrestling with?
Yeah, I'll say two. One that's in the book, one that's not. Let me start with the latter. As I wrote Fight Like Jesus, I was struck just by how much kingly imagery there is about Jesus there. Jesus riding a donkey. He says, go to the owner of the donkey, right? He sends his disciples, tell them the master needs it, which seems odd to us, right? But that was a customary way where kings and rulers would requisition modes of transport, right? The king needs it. Or like, and John, in his parenthetical aside, where he says Jesus took the donkey to fulfill Zechariah's vision in chapter 9, verse 9, where it says, see, your king is coming, lowly, humble, right? And goes on to talk about this peaceable king who will speak peace to all nations, right? And remove the weapons of war from his own people. Or how Jesus, I mentioned this in the book, but how Jesus's mantra of the kingdom of God, he could have talked about the people of God, the family of God, the fellowship of God, the community of God, but he talks about the kingdom of God. Or Friday, before Pontius Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my followers would fight. The sign above the cross, King of the Jews, right? Something that really struck me while I was working on this book, but it didn't feel like it would fit quite with the focus of this book, was I was also studying the word that we translate as faith in the New Testament, the Greek word pistis. So we translate it as faith, faithfulness, trust, trustworthiness, but its semantic range, its range of potential meanings is a lot bigger than that. It's also the word used in the New Testament and other writings of the time period to describe fidelity or loyalty to a cause or a person. And in fact, it's the word that's used in literature of that time period to describe giving one's fealty, one's fidelity, one's loyalty to a ruler or a king. And so here's Jesus with all this political language that the New Testament writers kind of co-opt, like Caesar says he's Lord, and they say, no, Jesus is Lord, right? And they then say that we're to give our pistis, our faith, our allegiance to Jesus. And, especially since, right, the book came out about 4 years ago, and I just am more and more convinced of, let me explain it in a story. Stories are better, right? Um, in the lead up to World War II, like Hitler, this is a quote. He said, "Our movement is Christian." And the Christians in Germany said, yeah. In fact, even like German Mennonites, this historic peace church tradition, 99% of them uh, became passionate supporters of Hitler. And I'm sitting there thinking, how? How could they do this? Well, one day, in fact, I remember one Mennonite academic named Dean Taylor telling the story of meeting an old Mennonite German pastor decades later and asking him, what was it like in the churches in Germany in the lead up to World War II? And the pastor said, our churches were full. There was passion in the pew. It felt like a revival. And then the pastor began to weep, and he said, it wasn't until decades later that I realized that, yes, there was a revival going on in our churches, but it was the spirit of nationalism being revived in us, not the spirit of Jesus. So about 8 years ago, while I was working on this book, it took 4 years to write this book, I learned about a group called the Bruderhof. And they're kind of like the Amish without the aversion to technology, or like a monastic community with families. And they started in Germany, and they were one of the only German groups to not give their allegiance to Hitler. And they were kicked out of Germany and persecuted for it. Had to flee to England, then got kicked out of England because they were suspect of all the Germans. Had to live in the jungles of Paraguay. Well, when I learned about this, I thought, I'm going to go visit one of those Bruderhof communities. And I'm in the middle of writing this book, right? And while I'm there, I was working in one of their factories, and I got to work one day alongside an older member. And so I asked him, and I said, how did you all stay faithful to your nonviolent stance, your commitment to peacemaking? How did you not support Hitler when everyone else was? Even the Mennonites were. How did you do that? And he said, well, my parents actually were some of the founding members. And he said, we had a friend of the community. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he didn't think I would know who that was. But I was like, Bonhoeffer. And he said, Bonhoeffer used to say to us all the time, our hearts have room for only one all-encompassing allegiance. And he said, we believed that. Jesus is our king. God is our lawgiver. And he said, and I'll never forget this, he said in the Bruderhof, the Sermon on the Mount is our constitution. And so I'm convinced more and more, again, I don't talk about it in the book, but I'm convinced to be faithful to the way of Jesus in our society today. We need to realize that our hearts have room for only one all-encompassing allegiance, and it's to King Jesus. So that's one lesson that really struck me as I wrote the book. It's not in there. I thought hopefully it'll come out in another book one day. Let me, in a much shorter answer, share the other lesson. There's about 30 peacemaking lessons throughout the book, roughly about 3 per day. And the one that has meant the most for me comes on Saturday of Holy Week. There's only a few verses in Scripture that talk about what we might describe as the descent into hell or the harrowing of Hades, right? And I know that there are whole books that try to unpack a theology of that. I don't know how they could do it on those 2 verses. Yes, a lot of church history, but I think there's an important peacemaking lesson. And I'm just going to read it if you don't mind. Because I can't word it better than I did in the book. So, yeah, here we go. When you contend for peace in places where it is painfully absent, most days feel like Holy Saturday, silent, confusing, hopeless. Peacemaking, and I'm feeling this today, I don't know about you, peacemaking can be hard, discouraging work. The destructive forces plaguing our communities often seem unstoppable. Yet even on days when all hope feels lost, Saturday reminds us that Jesus is at work, robbing the grave somehow and in some way, and plundering even the darkest of hells. This lesson does not mean that we deny the reality of death and suffering around us. Rather, Holy Saturday gives us the courage to remain immersed in such realities. And please hear this. In other words, on days when God appears absent, most absent, and on days where it feels as if the principalities and powers of this world have won, Holy Saturday reminds us to press on. Press on, for Jesus is at work beneath the surface, defeating death and dismantling despair. Press on, for the days when Jesus seems most lifeless may actually be the days when he's most actively working for our peace. And above all, press on, for Sunday is coming. That's the lesson that I keep going back to over and over again, because it is hard and discouraging work. Yeah.
Oh, Jason, thank you. Yeah, I needed it. I needed to hear that as I'm, walking along with the hands-off protests and so forth,
Mhm.
and hearing that Jesus is still at work. That's phenomenal. That I want to shift to a bit of a long-winded question. Not that my others haven't been long-winded, but maybe this is a little bit more long-winded, a little more seminary-esque, a little more technical, perhaps. So as I'm a biblical scholar, right? As a biblical scholar, I love what you're doing in the book. I really do. I enjoyed reading it. I'm using it in one of my university classes. I used it in the same class last year. I've been helping to guide a large adult class at my church that's been working through Fight Like Jesus. Last night, I attended a phenomenal spoken word poetry event in San Francisco with the 7 last poets, lyrical opposition, almost entirely a group of non-white artists who were inspired by what your book is doing and
Wow.
coming up with amazing day by day spoken word poetry. So it's been an
Wow.
incredibly helpful volume. There is one particular aspect of the book I'd like to press you on a little bit, just methodologically. And everybody can either take a snooze here for a second, but it is something that is intriguing to me. The thesis of your book, and you've already alluded to this, right? Your thesis of your book is that Jesus' tearful cry, if only you knew the things that make for peace, is the interpretive key to Holy Week. And I'm certainly
Yeah.
drawn to the argument. I think your overall point, I think the case you make across the book is almost entirely on point. Here's my concern. Luke 19:42 is the only place in any of the 4 gospels that refers to that particular lament by Jesus.
Yep.
So I wonder methodologically, and this is the kind of nerdy biblical scholar in me, if
Yep.
you're asking that one verse in Luke to carry too much sort of interpretive narrative weight, given that Matthew and Mark and John don't have that statement. Maybe more to the point, the gospel writers do not all tell the same story, as you know, right? Mark is making his case, Matthew's making his. A lot of what Matthew and Luke write is drawn from Mark, but they each tweak their source material significantly. Of course, John's narrative, you could argue, is kind of a horse of an entirely different color. It's kind of a narrative quite different from the others. So for me, the editorial intentions of the 4 gospel writers are often quite different from each other. They're not making the same points. And that's actually important for us, right? They're wanting their readers to understand a particular point that they're trying to get at or a vision for Jesus. I guess my concern is that despite how I love, pretty much everything about the book, it often feels a bit like you're glossing over these redactional or editorial details, kind of picking and choosing from whatever gospel account makes the point the best. And so I understand that approach kind of theologically, homiletically. I'm concerned that maybe we're ending up crafting an argument from a kind of composite narrative, right? But not one that actually reflects what the gospel writers are actually writing. Just one example of this, right, would be, and you note this, right, is that the, whatever we call it, the sort of ruckus in the temple that Jesus, stages in the 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? That's the very last, you could almost argue the last straw, before the authorities come after him. Whereas in John, that's in chapter 2. It's framed entirely differently, right? And so to kind of put those together makes sense in a theological sense, I think, but also then makes it a little tricky to think about the 7 days of Holy Week. So understanding that, I think the overall point in the book about Jesus' peacemaking and ours is valid and critically important. Do you see my discomfort with how you got there, and how would you respond? So just kind of throwing that out as a methodological question.
Great question. In fact, I wish I could like set up something like I could hit a buzzer and like blink siren lights and like confetti, because this is the fourth Lenten season since the book's been out, and it has been a while since someone has asked me a question that I haven't been asked before. So like points to you for that. Like so that's my first thought. My second thought is before I give my answer to the actual question, I think the most important thing for everyone to take away from your question and what will be my answer is not my answer, but the way in which you just asked that question. It just it's saturated with a humble and a respectful scholarship. Like, did you guys notice what he said? Like he said, I have this disagreement, or at least this concern about the book, yet I still find value in it. Man, I wish we all had that posture more often, right? So let's try to imitate that more. Like seriously, in our interactions, we're so quick once we find one thing we disagree with to throw out everything that someone might say. And so I just thank you for the way in which you asked that question. Okay, let me try
Absolutely.
to actually answer it. First, I'll just say about John's account of the temple cleansing being in chapter 2, right? I would just say, look at my first end note for that chapter. I explain why I believe John's gospel wasn't written chronologically, but kind of thematically. And I quote, some others like Craig Keener in that end note. But to the heart of the question, right? So first, let me just admit that this book was not birthed in a scholar's study. Like you've already heard, it was birthed on the streets and sidewalks, right, of the downtown East Side. It didn't come about from a theologian's office, but from a missionary's neighborhood, right? So let me just add that caveat. But then I'll say, I actually thought a lot about this factor. Do I only fight like Jesus looking at one gospel? Probably would have been Luke's, because of the lament being in Luke's. Or do I look at all four gospels? And as a writer or as a pastor developing a sermon series, you have to make choices, right? So here's my train of thought that ultimately led me to incorporate content from all four gospel accounts. I first thought about John Howard Yoder's book, The Politics of Jesus. I don't know if you've read it, but here, in summary, it canvasses Luke's gospel to show that Jesus was not apolitical. And Yoder actually says early on that he could have used any of the gospels to try to make that case that Jesus actually, there's political implications to Jesus's ministry. But he said that he chose Luke's gospel because it was considered to be the most apolitical of the gospels. But most of you are probably surprised to hear that Yoder would say that, right? Because nowadays, after Yoder's teaching's been out for a while, most of us look at Luke's gospel and say, well, it is the most political gospel. So yeah, you cherry picked Luke's gospel to make your case, right? And so then I thought about Ched Meyer's book, one of my favorite books, Binding the Strong Man, a political reading of this Mark's story of Jesus. And one of the critiques about his commentary on Mark's gospel, this political commentary on Mark, is that he chose Mark's gospel because Mark's gospel has a political slant. So it's like, well, you can't win. You cherry picked Mark's gospel, right? Or probably one of the most popular books that actually goes through each day of Holy Week, like mine, The Last Week by Borg and Crossan. It also uses Mark's gospel. And that's partly because Mark actually is the clearest about the timing of everything. So it is an easy, tempting one to use. And it's basically, I'd call their book a social justice reading of Mark's account of Holy Week. And the accusation after their book came out is, well, they chose Mark's gospel because Mark's gospel has a slant towards social justice. So it was like, you can't win if you only choose one. So that's why I thought I'm going to use all four. But also, if I only use Luke's gospel, the one that mentions Jesus's lament, then I felt like critics would accuse me of conveniently avoiding some of the passages, some of the accounts from Holy Week in the other gospels that seem to undermine my central thesis. And there's a lot of them. And look, I didn't write Fight Like Jesus for it to be an apologetic in the classic sense. Like, I'm not trying to defend Christian pacifism, right? I wasn't trying to just answer the rebuttals of those who don't hold to a Christian pacifist view. But it's interesting that many of the passages that those who do not hold to a pacifist reading of Scripture use occurred during Holy Week, and they're sprinkled throughout multiple of the Gospels. So, for example, I don't think you used the word cherry picking, but you talked how I could, it's by using all four Gospels, I could pick the passages that seem to support my thesis, right? I actually felt like I was doing the opposite, like the whip. Like, it would have been great if I had just avoided John's account of the temple cleansing. And I didn't even have to talk about the whip, right? Or Matthew's, Tuesday of Holy Week. That Tuesday chapter, that took me a year to write. It would have been 1 month to write if I had focused on some of the easy passages, like, the greatest commandment, love God, love your neighbor, or Matthew 25, I was hungry, you fed me, thirsty, you gave me, like, beautiful, easy peacemaking lessons there, right? 1 month I would have had it written. It took me 12 painstaking months to write that chapter because I wanted to address some of those passages that seem to most undermine our understanding of Jesus as a peacemaker, and not just neutralize those texts, but actually show how they advance our understanding of how Jesus makes peace. So I write about Jesus's answer to the debated tax question, where he says, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." And I was very aware of the history of how that passage was used to justify what's called a dual kingdom ethic. We as individuals in our walk with God, we have one set of ethics, but as citizens of an earthly nation, we follow another set of ethics. And it has led to some pretty horrific actions by Christians, right? So I didn't want to avoid that passage. Or I was thinking about, well, I've already mentioned the little apocalypse, right? It talks about wars and rumors of wars and nations fighting. And that passage too has been used to justify horrendous acts of violence. Or Jesus, now this one is in Luke, so I would have had to address it, but Jesus's instructions to his disciples in the upper room on Maundy Thursday, to buy swords. Like, what if I had chosen to go through Mark's gospel? I could have avoided that, right? And so in the end, I thought, no, I'm going to try to show how all four gospels, I will submit to you that perhaps that lament, obviously all four gospel writers didn't have that lament in their mind as they wrote about it. Though I believe that lament really did happen, and perhaps they were aware of it. But I do believe that all four gospels present a consistent witness of Jesus as nonviolent and promoting peace. And so I that's why I went that route. Yeah, but fantastic question. I hope I at least semi-addressed it.
No, that's that's a very appropriate and helpful response. And again, there was a certain aspect of that question that's more technical, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there is, as you were talking, I was thinking part of what would be fascinating would be to have a Fight Like Jesus version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4 that would actually track each of the gospels in their own narrative sensibilities, right? But I totally agree with you that there is definitely both a space for doing that and in some ways some necessity. And I picked up very quickly that you were making an effort not to, as you say, sort of cherry pick the easy ones, but to kind of go where things were tricky. And I think you did that very well. I have one more question, and then I'm going to turn it back to Matthew for his last question. So you end the book, and you've alluded to a little of this already, and I deeply appreciate your willingness to respond to all these. You end the book by noting, quote, "We live in a time when the majority of Christians, or perhaps just the most vocal ones, have chosen the way of the hammer, of violence, of Judas Maccabeus, the hammer, in 167 to 164 in the Maccabean revolt, right?" So today, many in the United States are claiming Jesus for the sake of nationalistic and other impulses that seem to be more about the hammer. I mean, you make this point, at least obliquely, right? That seem to be blatantly contradictory, and in many ways in denial of Jesus's legacy of peacemaking. And violence, from my perspective, takes many forms. Many of them are physical, but there are a lot that are not necessarily physical, but they are all kinds of forms of dehumanization. You've already alluded to some of those things you were observing in Vancouver and so forth. What are some of Jesus's key lessons for and I love that part of the book where you kept sort of pointing out those lessons, but maybe leave us with, what are a few of the key lessons for those of us who want to actually move beyond an intellectual response to your book and move into true peacemaking? How can we invite, maybe incite others to join us in a nonviolent love that Jesus is modeling? How do we fight, right, without
Yeah.
seeking power to do so? How do we fight falsehood, violence, injustice, evil, without becoming that which we hate? How do we keep our means consistent with our ends so that we don't become the Caiaphas figure,
Yeah.
who figures that, as long as the ends justify the means, things are good. It feels like, and I'm just going to speak for myself here, I wake up every morning, frankly, paying attention to the news and
Yeah.
realizing in this country that we are doing things that feel like they need to be fought right
Yeah.
now. And yet my toolbox sometime, even as someone who was passionately trying to toddle along behind Jesus, my toolbox tells me I need to figure out how to utilize power against their power. And I'm not quite sure sometimes where my notions of power, even as creative as Jesus is in the Sermon on the Mount, where that my power notions stop and Jesus's creativity begins. And I guess I'm just
Yeah.
wondering if you can, what would you leave us with? Because we are in Berkeley, or like most places in the country, we are struggling to figure out, what does toddling along behind Jesus look like right now? Because
Yeah.
staying silent can't be part of it, but using the tools of retribution and tit for tat don't seem appropriate either.
Yeah. Yeah. Last question, huh? So, man, classic professor there. I think there was 10 questions in there.
Yeah,
Uh,
I confess,
I'm trying to juggle. Okay. Let me try to touch on some of them. Key lessons from Jesus. I think the first is to really truly commit to overcoming evil with good, hatred with love. And in order to be able to do that consistently, I think we need to realize that Jesus calls us to prioritize faithfulness over effectiveness. We're called to be faithful, not necessarily always effective. Sometimes you end up getting crucified, right? Now, having said that, like I think of Chenoweth and Stephen. It's one of those books where I read her name, I don't know how to pronounce it right. They have a book called Why Civil Resistance Works. And they surveyed about 100 years of conflicts around the globe, and they discovered that nonviolent direct action, not always by Christian groups, but nonviolent direct action was twice as effective at bringing about peaceful outcomes as violent direct action. So I would actually argue that it is the most effective way to bring about peace, but we are called to prioritize faithfulness over what we think is going to end up being effective, right? In our quest to overcome evil with good, hatred with love. And I think this is crucial because I'm guessing this won't be quite as controversial to say to those of you on the West Coast, but this would get me in a lot of trouble here in Texas, right? Look, Trump is really good. He doesn't normally just make direct appeals to his followers telling them to hate the other side. Instead, the far more effective tactic that he uses is an indirect approach, where he tells his followers it's the other side that hates you. It's the other side, it's the radical left, it's the immigrants, whoever, you name it, right? That hate you, that are at war with your very way of life, that are against all you stand for and believe in. And once he's convinced his followers of this, and he's not the only one to do this, but man, he's so good at doing it. Once he convinces his followers of this, he's able to sit back and watch as the human tendency to respond in kind takes care of the rest. And we are susceptible to doing that as well, unless we really commit to overcoming evil with good, hatred with love. This isn't in the book, but I find it deeply ironic or profound or telling, maybe that's the best word, that the January 6th insurrection, do you guys know what Holy Day January 6th is? Epiphany. It's the day where the church has paused for centuries to remember the story of the wise men, these foreign magi coming to meet the Christ child. An essential part of that story is that some political rulers will do anything to hold on to power, right? Herod told these wise men that he wanted to worship the Christ child. He hid his true intentions from them, that he actually wanted to kill him, right? And were it not for divine intervention, were it not for an angel coming and warning these wise men, they would have been duped. In other words, even the wisest among us can be fooled. And so we must commit. If we think, oh, I can overcome evil with evil when I'm certain that it's a just and righteous cause, you might be duped, right? And so to commit to overcome evil with good, hatred with love. So that would be my first thought. Second is you cannot do it alone. And man, I am feeling that right now, here in Texas. You cannot go about trying to wage peace on your own. Look, on your own, all you can do is talk about peace and demand justice. Like you see this all the time on Twitter, or at least I did before I deleted my account. But in community, you can actually embody peace and do justice. I think it's one of the most important lessons that I share in the book in Thursday of Holy Week. And in the downtown East Side, that's when I saw the fruit of our peacemaking efforts magnify 100-fold as we welcomed, as a missional community, our homeless neighbors into our home to eat with us, to be like family with us, to live with us until they got into rehab, right? To live with us after rehab. We saw so many lives transformed because in community, people can actually experience God's love. In community, we can model on a small scale the justice and the peace that we long to cultivate and pray for on a grand scale. Does that make sense? You use the word creativity, and let me share this quickly because I want to make sure there's time for Q&A, but I don't mention this at all in the book. But in Vancouver, as a missional community, we had out-of-town church groups saying, how can we get involved? And at first we were like, I don't know. And then we had our homeless neighbors hearing about some of the injustices going on with our teams in the slums of Asia. And they're saying, what can we do? And at first we thought, I don't know. So eventually we started a weekly gathering that we called Creative, which is why I thought of it, Creative World Justice. And our homeless neighbors and suburban church groups, we'd all come and we'd have a potluck together first. And then it turned out to be a beautiful rhythm, kind of like Sunday school is a great weekly rhythm to ensure that Christians are regularly engaging in the study of Scripture. These Creative World Justice gatherings became a rhythm to ensure that we as Christians were regularly working for justice. So for us, this might look different if you guys actually try to apply this there. But for us, 6 days out of the week, we are focused on the downtown East Side. So for Creative World Justice, we said, we're going to try to bring about just change somewhere else in the world, somewhere that we have a connection to, though, right? So for you, it may be, we're going to try to bring about just change in our locality, right? And so what we would do, each word stands for something. Justice. Some weeks we would learn about God's heart for justice for the poor, how the prophets of old creatively worked for justice, etc., right? Some weeks we would often spend 8 weeks in a row learning, so the world, Creative World Justice, learning about a particular injustice going on in the world. And we would bring in people who've been experienced by it. We'd learn about it. We'd study it really well. With the ultimate goal of coming up with some way to creatively work for just change in that situation, believing that though we were dirt poor as a community, right, living on like $16,000 a year in Vancouver, right, though we were dirt poor, we believe that God had empowered us with the giftings, the skills, the talents, and the resources to work for just change. So let me just share a couple examples. Early on, we learned about some friends of ours in Singapore, and they said, so many homes in Singapore have foreign domestic workers, and Singapore gives every worker in the country a day off, legally entitled to a day off, except foreign domestic workers. They're not allowed a day off, and they are basically enslaved. And so there was a Singaporean consulate 1 mile from the downtown East Side. So we dressed up, our ladies had like aprons on and handcuffed with like vacuum cord, power cords around their wrists, and the men all held signs about some of the stats going on there. And we delivered a letter to the Singaporean consulate saying, would you change this one line that would give foreign domestic workers a day off? Hong Kong does it. Kuala Lumpur does it. Would you do it, right? And they didn't. But man, it got all over the news, all these, enslaved maids outside the consulate. So then we wrote to the 10 largest churches in Singapore, humble, trying to be kind, not arrogant, like you should know better, but saying, hey, would you encourage your congregations to urge your politicians to give foreign domestic work, to change the law so that they're legally entitled to a day off? And while you're legislating for that, would you model the change that you want to see by asking your congregations to give all their foreign domestic workers a day off? Within a year, it had become law. Soon after, my friend Adi, an Indonesian, he said it's the same way on cruise ships. He said, they take our passports. It's called flags of convenience because cruise ships sail in international waters. Most of the time, they can register in whatever country they want to. So they mostly register in these two little tiny nations that have abysmal worker rights laws. And so we were enslaved. We didn't get a day off. We couldn't leave the ship. They actually took our passports, so we couldn't leave. We had to pay back a loan in order to get them, which took years. And we said, well, this isn't good. There's cruise ships 2 miles from us. And we thought, well, it worked having all these enslaved maids dressed up. So we came up with the Pirates of Justice, and flash mobs were big back then. So you can picture like 200 pirates walking their way through the downtown east side to some cruise ships, and a whole bunch of people joining us as we went. And of course, the news stations all came out, and we made the news again to raise awareness about what was going on in cruise ships. A Canadian actress working on one of the cruise ships saw the news report, came to our community and said, my heart's been breaking for this very issue. What can I do? And it took us weeks to come up with a plan, but we had some artists in our community. So this Canadian actress, I won't say her name in case she would get in trouble, but she smuggled 100 disposable cameras, back when those were a thing, onto the ship with a little note in various languages, Indonesian, Tagalog, etc., saying, would you take pictures of what life is like for you below deck? And would you write a sentence or two about it? And we'll get it translated. And then we rented an art studio in Vancouver, and we hung their pictures up and told their story. One last example, the Olympics were coming in 2010, and the city promised to do a whole bunch of stuff for the homeless because housing prices go up. They didn't. They promised 3,200 low-income housing units. They didn't build a single one. So we built 3,200 gingerbread houses and delivered them to City Hall saying, remember this, right? Or sex trafficking really goes up when all these out-of-town men come in, right? And so we partnered with some other local NGOs, and we came up with a campaign called Buying Sex is Not a Sport. And we were going to have kind of construction vests and cameras and stand outside some of the brothels that we knew existed to try to protect women and scare off the men, right? But we also made these giant stencils, maybe 4 feet by 4 feet, that said, buying sex is not a sport. And our plan was to use sidewalk chalk and put that message on the sidewalk outside of these brothels. But at the very first one, a cop came up and said, you can't do that. That's defacing public property. And we were so bummed until he said, but, my brother has a power washer, and I suppose you could power wash over the stencil, and that's cleaning the sidewalk. So we power wash the message on the right. So here's just a few examples of a community saying, let's collectively, as a community, come up with creative ways to work for peace.
Oh my gosh, that's fantastic. I mean, as you were talking, I couldn't help but think that is the vision, right? Yeah, and just to underscore this, and I'll hand it back to Matthew, but part of what I try to do with my college students is to help them see it, that at least in my estimation, right, we misread, for example, Jesus, right, directly in the Sermon on the Mount, even, right, when we read the things that he says as sort of a new form of 10 commandments, right, that, you must do this, you must do this, right? Yeah. So, if somebody hits you, turn the other cheek, you must do that as some, as opposed to seeing what he's doing as creative resistance and street theater to in the face of oppression, right? Which is, those are contemporary examples you've just given us. Absolutely beautiful. So thank you. It's been fun for me I appreciate you letting me sneak in and ask a few questions. Matthew, I'm going to turn this back to you to take us to the next step.
Thank you very, very much. It was hopeful. It was so many really, really wonderful, lovely things. And I think for everybody, hope is an important thing, and practical things, practical ideas getting people started, even just the idea of like in community, faithfulness in community, working together. That was so good. I'll just quickly mention there might have been a glitch with the questions. Everyone, you're probably burning with questions. Please do send something on the side so that I can ask. I'm assuming there's questions to be had. Send the questions on the side. Both of you, Michael and Jason, that was so good. My question, you can feel free if I'm just waiting for something to get because I didn't want to steal it from someone else, but I'd like to ask the question about the pastor. So I think pastors still have a lot of influence on people. If you were able to have all the pastors in a room magically like in Hermione's bag, and they had to listen to you, and they had to listen to you with a smile on their face, because when we're smiling, we're a little bit more receptive. You've already said so many great things, but if you were speaking to pastors, what are some of the things you would tell them?
I think just one thing. Thank you. I mean, like, thanks for not giving up on the bride of Christ. Thanks for not abandoning the church. It can't be easy to pastor these days. Like, I think of like Dickens' line from, what is it? A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. And that's how our congregations feel. Like half of, at least in Texas, half of the congregation that I attend thinks it's the best of times right now. And half of the congregation thinks it's the worst of times. Like, it has got to be so hard to pastor. And so thank you for not giving up on the church. It is hard. Like, I attend a Quaker church here, and one of the traditions in the one of the things that Quakers do is have a time of open worship, a time of quiet where you listen to God's Spirit. And if you feel led, you can stand up and say something, speak a word for the congregation, ask for prayer, etc. I've only ever stood up twice in all my years now at this church. But one of those was the day after J.D. Vance made an explicit claim about Christianity a few months ago, where he said, it's a Christian principle that Christians are to prioritize loving their family and fellow citizens. And then he said, and they're meant to then and only then prioritize and rank last care for the foreigner. And I heard that Sunday morning before I went to church, and it just broke my heart. So I don't really have a controversial side to me. Like, I don't like controversy. I don't like making edgy comments, so I was gentle when I stood, but I read it verbatim because I wanted to honor J.D. Vance by not misrepresenting his quote. And then I just said, hey guys, he made an explicit claim about Jesus, but Jesus calls us to the exact opposite. Like Matthew 25, I was hungry, you fed me, thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, an immigrant, a foreigner, you took me in, right? Like Jesus says one day you say you love all people, prove it. And the test I have to prove to see if you love all people is if you love those who are not normally the recipients of love. Those people the world normally ranks last. I'm flipping it. The last are going to be first. And so I gently raised that in our church. And man, the uproar and the anger. I haven't been allowed to talk in church since. Like, the pastors want me to, but they're afraid that it's going to just continue to ruffle feathers. So I've said, maybe best, let's give it a couple months, right? I'll help lead worship. I don't have to speak, fill in. But I thought I was being gentle. And so if gentle words like that, when someone makes a direct statement about how Christians are meant to behave, and we lovingly and gently try to address it, and it sparks such backlash, man, it has got to be hard to pastor. And so I just want to say again, thank you. And don't give up on the church. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I pray, even if it's just with a few in your congregation that you feel safe with, that together, I think whenever at least 3 are gathered together, there's community. And you can begin to do what I talked about creating a space for others to come in and experience God's transforming love, not just hear about it, not just see it being demonstrated, but actually experience it. And you can become a peacemaking community. Yeah. So just thank you. It's not easy. Don't give up. Find encouragement in each other. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Question. Are there some examples you can share of groups or communities of Christians engaging your book and collectively discerning present-day applications/implications? Are there modes of collective discernment you can recommend for organizations like New College Berkeley that network with congregations and the unchurched?
Can you read that last part again? Sorry, I got started thinking and I missed part of the last sentence.
Are there modes of collective discernment you can recommend for organizations like New College Berkeley that network with congregations and the unchurched?
Yeah, great. Oh man, such a good question. I've been really surprised. So I didn't write Fight Like Jesus to preach to the choir. So I actually love that nonviolence isn't in the title. Like I think a lot of people wouldn't even pick it up, right? Um, and I've been really surprised at the different Christian traditions and denominations that have been using this book. Very few, honestly, are from Anabaptist background or Quaker backgrounds. It's been from Reformed and Southern Baptist and Presbyterian. I mean, you name it, right? And it's been beautiful to see that the Spirit is stirring and calling people from all different Christian traditions and backgrounds to say, let's re-embrace and remember why we call Jesus the Prince of Peace. So, but what could we actually do, communities like NCB, to help other churches with this? I mean, I have seen churches come up with some very concrete things, like in Galveston, which is an island outside of Houston here. There's a beautiful church that is doing some pretty amazing work now with the homeless, in part because of reading Fight Like Jesus. And it's been cool to see, really cool to journey with them. I mean, my own church, we started a shower ministry to homeless where we take the mobile shower unit down to downtown. We've also housed the homeless at our church once a quarter with a ministry called Family Promise. A lot of peacemaking things as well. Again, not everyone in the church agrees with it, but there's some, and we get together and try to come up with creative ideas. I think the creative role justice that I just mentioned is a great way to work with churches to help them begin to ask what they can do. And when I've led creative role justice groups outside of Vancouver, one of the things I'll do is um, in community development circles, it's asset-based community development. It's kind of a shift in mindset when instead of looking at an impoverished neighborhood and saying they have no resources, no skills, no what, you say, actually, I believe that God has given skills and assets and beautiful talents to my neighbors in this community. What are the assets of our community, right? One of the exercises we would do in Indonesia, and I've done with other church groups, is you have the group. You say, what are some of the issues that break your heart? What are some of what's some of the brokenness you see in your locality? And people may shout out 10 different things, right? And you get a big piece of paper and you write down all 10 kind of in a circle. And then I usually give 10 M&Ms, and I say, look, you can eat some of these if you want to, but you get 10 votes. You can say, this is the issue that I think is most important. And you can put all 10 M&Ms on that issue. You can put 3 on one, you can put 2 on another. Everyone vote. And you see what are some of the most important issues. But then before you then say, okay, that's the issue that we as a church are going to try to invest in and address, you do ask a follow-up question. In Indonesia, we would ask questions like, how much power do you think we have as a community to bring about just change to that situation? If the community believed that the sickness was because of the gods, then it was going to be really hard to convince them to work on it. Or if it was all on the police, that might be hard to address. So you ask some sort of question like, and how much power do you think we might have to bring about change? And then you kind of factor that in, and you just collectively decide as a group, okay, we're going to try to be peacemakers beginning in our locality in a very concrete way. And that just gets the conversation started. I don't know if that was a helpful answer, but.
Yeah, no, totally. Thank you. Do you have any stories of people changing their minds about fighting after having read your book that have really encouraged you?
I have, yes, definitely, including like my own dad. Like I mentioned at the start, my parents were both in the military. They were never like zealous military folks, like my mom just wanted to get out of Michigan, right? So she joined the army. But dad he was such a strict man growing up, man, and he's turned into this gentle soul. He's now the accountant for Servants, the group that I was with. And he's just become this beautiful person for peace. But I actually have 2 other stories that come to mind, and stories are the best. So let me just tell us 2 stories. Soon after I graduated Messiah, before moving to Vancouver, I joined a group going down from Messiah to Fort Benning, Georgia? I think that's the name of it, where there was a School of the Americas, it was called. They changed the name to something no one can remember, but it used to be called School of the Americas. And it was a training school for Latin American soldiers. And through, what do they call that, where you like force the government to release documents through like, I forget the term for that. Like you go to the courts and they have to release stuff. So they had to release their training manual that was used back in the 80s. And it was revealed that they had actually been training Latin American soldiers in like how to kidnap and use torture tactics, etc. And so like those who assassinated Oscar Romero, graduates of that school. Someone who had gone on to rape some nuns and kill others, graduates of that school. So some Jesuit Catholic priests, they started an annual gathering to try to get the School of Americas closed. It was probably the only time I'd gone actually to an event like that, right? And I remember standing there and they were singing some kind of hippie peace songs, everyone in the crowd. And this young lady in front of me, she had some, I can't remember now, but it was some sort of clearly worded nonviolent peace t-shirt on, right? And I think she had a WWJD bracelet on. Like those were pretty popular, back then. And in the middle of one of those hippie songs, she just raises her fist in the air and she yells, "Bush, I hate you. I wish you were dead." And I remember thinking, oh man, that's not very pacifist-like. Well, fast forward to Vancouver, and my friend Aaron White, man, he's like 6'4". I would not want to get in a fight with him. He helps lead a Salvation Army group there. Pretty radical, living in the downtown east side. It's some of what are called the SROs there. And he told me about a friend of his. I can't remember his name anymore, but he said, Jason, my friend is the only person I've ever met who said that he hates Gandhi. I was like, he hates Gandhi? How can you hate Gandhi? And he said, well, he served in the Canadian Armed Forces, and he said that he felt like Gandhi made his own efforts to work for peace look bad. And I was like, okay, I guess I can see that. And Aaron said, but one day, my friend and I, we were walking down the streets of the downtown east side, and all of a sudden we looked across the street, and there was an elderly homeless man getting beat up by a younger homeless man. And before I could even think about what to do, my friend ran across the street. He pushed the two men apart. He stood between them and he began to say, just walk away. Just walk away. I can't let you beat him up. If you must beat up someone, beat up me, but just walk away. And he said, man, that younger homeless man, he swore a couple times at my friend, but he didn't know what to do. So eventually he just started to walk away. And as he did so, he turned around and he said, man, who made you Gandhi? I love that story. So take those two stories together. And it's why I like to think of myself as an aspiring peacemaker. I don't actually say I am a peacemaker. Like, I hope I won't be like the person who has all the right words on their t-shirt, who's written books on peacemaking, but does not embody the heart of Christ one day when faced with injustice. I'd rather be like Aaron's friend, right? Who said he hated Gandhi, but was a beautiful example of non-violent peacemaking. So yeah, I don't know. It's a little tangential to your question, but that's what comes to my mind, those two stories.
Stories are super, super powerful. Yeah. So thank you so very much for those stories. It's really impactful, right? Because we can read an ethical treatise, and if we're good, if we're scholarly, we can, put it inside of our heads, but a story just bypasses all those things and just makes it visceral right now. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Jason, can I ask one more? This is Michael again. Can I ask one more question that is occurring to me? Let me play the kind of a devil's advocate kind of question.
Okay.
I could imagine somebody saying, okay, Jason Porterfield has discovered that Jesus was really about peace, particularly in the final week of his life. That's pretty clear. He's made that case. But that's just one part of the gospel. That's partitioning out just one thing Jesus was concerned about, but what really Jesus, I mean, you've sort of alluded to this already, right? I know lots of people would say, well, Jesus' entire point was to come and die for our sins. And so that sort of, you may not be a quote unquote social justice warrior, but you're kind of implying that Jesus is. So, maybe that's a sort of, I'm trying to play devil's advocate here, right? But that maybe that's a kind of extracurricular or even co-curricular thing, to put it in school speak, right? Rather than the core issue. And one of the things that I loved, now moving into Michael here away from the devil's advocate, right, is you say very clearly that Jesus in John 20 says, peace be with you, my peace I leave with you, right? As the Father has sent me, so send I you, right?
Yeah.
This, and you say very emphatically, this is Jesus giving his followers a mission of peacemaking. That this is not a kind of partitive thing separate from Jesus's real work, or, you know, evangelism or something like that.
Yeah.
Am I reading that correctly? I mean, I guess the way I'm trying to put this in a little bit of an edgy way, but what I'm getting the sense of, and maybe I'm giving myself away here, is that partly what I hear Jesus saying, and I'm wondering if this is partly what you mean, is that to live the gospel, to live out Jesus's love, to love one another as he has loved us, by definition, ends up with a peacemaking mission, not just in Holy Week, but literally that becomes the modus operandi for the church. Is that fair, or am I trying to make peace bigger than
Yeah.
you even would think of it, I guess?
Well, if we define peace more along the lines of the Hebrew concept of shalom, I think
Shalom,
that it
right?
is
Yeah.
fair to say that this was central to his mission. You know, I'll sometimes say that Jesus came to restore and make right all that was damaged and made wrong by the fall, by our fall into sin. And yes, that meant coming to give us life, but it also meant coming to show us how to live that life and to correct our misguided assumptions about the giver of life, right? You know, I don't think it's a coincidence that Jesus only identifies two groups of people that he calls children of God. Only two groups of people does he ever call children of God. Peacemakers, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God, and those who love their enemies, for you will be a child of your Father in heaven. And I don't think he's making necessarily a salvation statement there. I think what he's saying is, when you wage peace and seek to love your enemies, nothing shows the character of your Father in heaven more than that. People will look at you and say, wow, you look just like your Father in heaven. You're the spit and image of the Heavenly Father, the spirit and image of God, right? And, you know, the early church, I actually, if you go to my website, just my name, jasonporterfield.com, scroll to the bottom, I have a free resource that I'm actually updating now, but it's called 100 Early Christian Quotes on Not Killing. I'm upping it. I think I'm right at about 130 now, right? But the early church, they were passionate about this. And to your question, like there's some quotes in there that say stuff like, it's the pinnacle principle of loving enemies. And I would argue that the reason that the early church grew so quickly was primarily because of how they cared for the poor and how they loved their enemies. Like in Vancouver, we often said fascination precedes explanation. Like we couldn't keep up with our neighbors' questions as we welcomed them into our home to live with us. Why would you leave good paying jobs and move to the downtown east side? Why don't you have a TV? You know, questions like that. And we couldn't keep up with their questions. The gospel or the book of Acts, right? Like every sermon, every explanation is preceded by something that either causes someone to get infuriated or to be curious and ask a question, right? And so I see that in the early church, you know, man, they love even their enemies. Look how they care for their poor. They care for our poor better than we do. One of the emperors said, right, of the early church. So yeah, I think, like I remember someone from my home church in Pennsylvania saying, you got to get past this justice stuff. This isn't why we pay you as a missionary. You're supposed to be about verbal evangelism and planting churches. And I care about people knowing about Jesus. Like I actually do care about evangelism, especially like testifying to God's goodness, right? And I do care about forming church communities. But I wanted to say to her, I've seen more people come to Christ as I've cared for the poor and sought to cultivate peace and love enemies than when I've just gone door to door like I used to do in Pennsylvania and hand out tracts. Like way more people come to Christ, right? Yeah. Hopefully that's an answer.
No, absolutely. Thank you. And I appreciate the balance there, right? I mean, part of my concern in teaching university students these days, right, is I think, we often say where's the younger generation gone in the church? And I think part of the reality is they're not seeing a whole lot that's distinctive in us, right? They hear us talking about how we want to make sure everybody hears the good news, but oftentimes that good news doesn't really actually manifest to, quite the love that they're expecting to see, right? And so it seems to me that what you're getting at really holds those together. And I think for my money, it's tracking with where Jesus is going. So I deeply appreciate you. Deeply appreciate it.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you very, very much for this. This was really, really, really good. And also for the questions. Thank you, Michael, very much for those really, really thoughtful questions. And from the others, I'm going to have a link available and we'll send it out. If I'll have a link, Jason, to your book, and I think I have some in the other thing, but I'll put also, if you want, and I know both of you were throwing around author names a lot. If you maybe both of you want to have like a wish list for people, maybe the top 5 or top 10 books. I mean, that might be really hard, probably is, but something, that you found useful, I'll put that on the bottom of the link for people. Okay. Other than that, I think that is about everything. And I think this is one of those times that people are like, oh, it should go further. Thank you very, very, very much again. This is really, 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 really lovely. And everybody else, thank you for being part of this and for sharing and also for making this possible. It's a lovely, lovely thing. Jason, thank you. Michael, thank you. Thank you. Everybody have a lovely evening.
Everyone. Thank you.
Night, everybody.